When we encounter a physical object, say the exact texture, color, and location of a single flower, our sensory experience feels immediate and complete. We naturally assume our human intellect reaches right out into physical reality and grasps that individual material object directly. This diagram of scholastic epistemology reveals a structural barrier. The intellect's object is exclusively the abstract universal, not the material individual. It comprehends the broad concept of flowerness, not physical petals. This creates a paradox. How can we reason about this specific flower? Direct intellectual knowledge of a material object is a strict epistemological impossibility. The data types simply do not match. Yet we constantly judge and evaluate particular bodies in our daily lives. To do this, the mind must have a structural workaround. That workaround is indirect perception. It relies entirely on the underlying unity of the human soul to pass information between separate cognitive faculties. The schoolmen defined this specific indirect mechanism as per accidentis knowledge. The intellect never sees the individual object face to face. To understand physical reality, it must execute a complex sequence of internal data processing, bridging the gap between its highest powers and its basest senses. This Renaissance-style sketch maps the hierarchy of the soul's faculties, starting from the physical interface and moving upward. At the base are the inferior powers, the senses and the imagination. Their specific role is gathering raw, disjointed data from the physical environment. When a specific physical flower enters the system, it registers within this lower sensory boundary. The imagination takes these separate sensory inputs, light, shape, scent, and compiles them into a cohesive representative image. This compiled artifact is called the phantasm. It acts as the mind's internal representation of an individual material entity. Even as an internal artifact, the phantasm remains tethered to the physical traits of that specific flower. It encodes exact color, physical size, and spatial location. To acquire knowledge, the higher intellect must reach down and interact with this sensory artifact. This top-down interaction is the act of abstraction. A pristine, perfectly symmetrical icon representing flowerness separates from the phantasm and ascends into the intellect boundary. All the specific material traits are left behind in the lower faculty. The intellect takes only the pure, universal concept. The intellect now successfully holds the universal essence of the flower, but by discarding the material traits to get it, the intellect has isolated itself from the actual physical individual. If the intellect is currently holding an abstract universal, how does it know anything about the specific flower it just left behind? The answer relies on a concept called the unity of the soul. Because the faculties are unified in a single soul, one faculty cannot act without the next higher faculty being immediately apprised of its action. The intellect utilizes this tight integration to look back at its own behavior. It executes a reflex act. It turns its attention backward to perceive its own action of abstracting the essence from the phantasm. To demonstrate exactly how this creates indirect per accidentis knowledge, the schoolmen used a biological analogy. This schematic compares human vision on the left with the intellect on the right. The eye targets color directly, per se, but registers the colored object indirectly, per accidentis. The intellect works identically. It knows the universal directly, but registers the material object indirectly. This reflex act generates two distinct types of consciousness. The first is psychological consciousness. The intellect recognizes its own internal modification, drawing the conclusion, I have the idea of a flower. The second is ontological consciousness. The intellect views that internal idea as a mathematical expression of an external object, concluding, the object from which I abstracted this essence is a flower. The intellect knows the individual particular body not by observing it directly, but by catching it in the reflection of its own internal operation. When abstract knowledge successfully processes a physical reality, it acts as an active, illuminating force. Because of the reflex act, the intellect no longer views the individual physical object merely as a raw, disconnected sensory fact. The intellect actively adds conceptual structure to the sensitive cognition. Looking at the fully assembled architecture of the scholastic mind, we map this final integration. The intellect is already in possession of the abstracted idea, projecting that concept downward. It cannot prevent the light of this idea from reflecting directly onto the individual physical object. The individual object is presented to the intellect as the concrete realization of the abstract essence it just acquired. Subjectively, this mechanical loop works because the senses, the imagination, and the intellect all have their seat in the exact same soul. Objectively, it holds because the physical individual perceived by the senses is exactly the same entity from which the intellect abstracted the universal. The architect's greatest limitation, its inability to process the physical world directly, forces a unified internal system where abstract truth and concrete reality are permanently bound together.